guys, welcome back to my channel. So, I am here with my October wrap-up, and I'm feeling very ambitious this month, and I'm trying to do it all in one. I basically read all over the board with genres this month, and there wasn't anything that I could have pulled out to break it down evenly into two different parts, so I'm just gonna attempt to talk about all 18 books that I read in one video. I know, this is a horrible idea. So on that note, let's just jump into it so we can get the ball rolling. As always, I have them organized from my least liked to my most liked. I have them already here so I can just flip them around as I go. October was a fairly mediocre reading month. I had a couple stellar standout books, but honestly, my average rating is like a low 3-star. There was a lot of disappointing stuff that I read this month, so let's start with that. So the first 3 books that I have to talk about are gonna be upsetting for me and for you guys if you guys read along with me. So let's start with book number 1, where I gave 2 stars to The Cabin at the End of the World by Paul Tremblay. This was our last Friday Fright-a-thon book that we read. We read it the last week of October. I despise this book quite a bit. Everything about this, like, it had good things that I could see that people would really like in this. Like, the writing was very unique. All of the points of view were very different. Like, not only did we jump from character to character, some points of view were multiple people. Like, we were reading in a we point of view, but it was just not enjoyable. Like, if you like really tense stories where, like, you don't really know what's going on and you're okay with not really having a resolution or anything, you'll probably love this, but I, on the other hand, was just like, what the hell did I just read? This was basically a story about a little family who go on vacation in, like, kind of a remote area where they don't have cell service or anything. I know, start of a horror movie or horror book. Basically, a group of people come up to this cabin and they demand to be let in, and they basically propose to them that these people know that the apocalypse is coming and the only way to prevent it is if one of them sacrifices another one. And it just gets kind of brutal, but it's very confusing, and like the trust is weird in this book, not only between characters but between you and the narrators, and it's just, it was a tense book, but not to the point where like I was at the edge of my seat waiting to happen. It was tense as in I just wanted it to end. So I gave this 2 stars. It was just highly disappointing to me. Again, the writing was like okay, as in the writing was different and unique, but I didn't like it, so I gave this 2 stars. This was my least liked book of the month. I finished it and I was just like, what the hell? Okay, so starting off to a smashing start, moving on to the second book that I really didn't like. We've got The Whisper Man. We have another Friday Fright-a-thon book. We struck out big time this round. Not many of us liked any of these choices. This was a huge release though, and everybody was talking about this. It was a book of the month choice. Like, it was a big title this year, and it was just one of the big thrillers that came out around Halloween time, so we thought it was fitting. I didn't like this one either. This one was like, it started out really good and really creepy and with a really good premise, and I honestly was sucked in because this was based off of the author's kind of real life experiences. Not like to the full extent of the story, but it was based off of the author's toddler talking about like this imaginary character, and then he evolved it into being like a serial killer. And the serial killer was back. But it was one of those stories where it started out really good and it had a really good setup for the plot and where the direction of the story was going. We didn't know if it was going to get slightly paranormal or not, or just straight up really messed up serial killer type of stuff. And then I feel like the plot just fell flat. Like, it just got boring. And like, even when we got to like the climactic moments and the big resolution type of moments, I was just like, that's it? Okay. And I read this the second week of October. I believe this was our second choice, and I'm filming this in the first week of November. I already forget things from it. It was clearly not very memorable. I gave this one 2 stars as well. I didn't hate it as much as The Cabin, but not very memorable. Probably won't keep it. And while we're on this roll, let's talk about the next book, The Escape Room by Megan Golden. This one was better. I gave this one 3 stars. It still was not great. But this one is one of those books that I can kind of separate the story from the writing. The writing, I think, was really, really great. She really went into depth with all of these characters in this book, and you really got to know them. That being said, none of the characters are likable in this story, which is not necessarily a thing that's going to make me rate a book low, but there has to be something redeeming in the story for me to actually enjoy it more. Like, I'm all for unlikable characters. I actually am one of the rare people. I kind of prefer it because I feel like that puts a lot more pressure onto the story and the plot line. This one did not succeed at that, though. This one basically follows a group of employees who work at this really high-power investing firm and how competitive it is and how hard it is to work in this field, how your life is dedicated to it. Basically, we get thrown into the story when a group of them gets called into this, like, emergency business meeting one night, and it turns out that they are all being called into an escape room. Like, you know, escape rooms that people go and do, like, team building activities with, where, like, you all work together to get out of a room sort of thing. It's basically that, but it's not really an escape room. It's just an elevator that shuts down. So this entire book is very claustrophobic, which I'm not a big claustrophobic person. Like, that's not a huge phobia of mine, but it makes me uncomfortable reading about it after a long period of time. Like, this has the same effect that reading about books set in space where they're running out of oxygen, or books set underwater, again, where they're running out of oxygen. It adds that extra element of, like, tension, of, like, pressure, of, like, you have a limited time sort of feeling. So, like, that was good, but it was like the whole book was exhausting. So basically we are following what's happening currently and the clues that they're getting. In my opinion, this book read closer to Saw, like the Saw movie franchise, where they basically get clues or they get hints given to them periodically in this trapped elevator that they have to try and figure out and decipher how to get out. But it's kind of like they are pit against each other. And it was just, it was okay, but it was just not anything enjoyable for me. Like, I think the characters were very well written, and there were some definite choices made with how these characters were written, so I can respect the writing. The story itself was just kind of okay. Like, it wasn't super scary, it was tense, and it was also just kind of, how do I say it? All the characters were obnoxious, and you just kind of wanted to punch all of them in the face. It was one of those types of books. So, I gave it 3 stars. We bumped it up a star from the first 2, but again, it was not that great. So, we did not do great, in my opinion. So the Friday Fridathon choices were kind of all strikes for me so far. Moving away from thrillers for a little bit, the next book I want to talk about is The Girl the Sea Gave Back by Adrienne Young. This was a book that I purposely kind of put off until my expectations lowered, because I adored Sky in the Deep, her debut book, and this is kind of a spin-off novel of that. It's not a direct sequel. I wouldn't even really consider it a companion novel. It's just another book set in this world a little bit after the events of that, so we get to see, like, the aftermath of what happened in the first book. This follows a girl who gets taken in by a separate clan. This is set during, like, Viking times, by the way, in case you guys didn't know about Sky in the Deep. It's pretty authentically written as far as, like, the time period and the culture of Viking clans, so I really like that aspect of it. But anyway, this follows a girl who gets taken in at a very young age. She gets kind of washed up on shore in a burial ship, and she gets taken into a separate clan that obviously is not her own, and she is brought on as their, like, kind of future teller, like fortune teller type of thing. Like, she can read runes and she can predict what's going to happen from the gods. So it follows her story, but it also follows a character who is part of the new clan that was established in Sky in the Deep. I don't want to spoil anything from Sky in the Deep, but we follow a character who takes place in the events after the clan issue in Sky in the Deep. So those are our 2 perspectives that we're reading from in this story, and how they end up meeting across the battlefield and have to work together to do things. I'm trying to keep the spoiler free. So this book, I gave it 3 stars. I still really liked it. I feel like I never connected to the characters like I did in Sky in the Deep. I feel like Sky in the Deep, you were on the battlefield with them. Like, you were in their heads. You really got a feeling of how the clans felt about each other, like, internally. This one I felt somewhat removed. And it was still a really cool story, and I still really like the elements that were added to this world and to the story, but I just didn't like either of the main characters too much. Like, I feel like I wanted to know a little bit more about both of them instead of just being tossed into the story. So I gave it 3 stars. I'm still very curious to see what Adrienne Young does next. Like, I like her writing enough to trust her with a lot of different types of things, but this one was not nearly as exciting as Sky in the Deep was to me. I adored Sky in the Deep, and this one was just like, it was okay. It was a nice continuation, but it wasn't amazing. The next book I want to talk about is a very, very short novella that I ended up listening to, called Swipe by Kennedy Ryan. You guys know that I'm trash for Kennedy Ryan. She's probably my favorite author at this point, and I'm just trying to go through all of her backlist and, like, check all of her things off of the list, and Swipe was actually a very short audiobook novella that was written exclusively for Read Me Romance, which is a podcast that is hosted by other indie romance authors, and they basically go through every week and release a new episode where you get another chapter of the audiobook and they talk about it. Listened all the way through all of the parts of Swipe, which is a novella that Kennedy Ryan wrote that was good, but not great. And I think Kennedy Ryan really shines in her full-length novels because she gets so involved with like modern issues in society and things that these characters are facing and their backstories and obstacles they have to overcome. In a novella setting, we got a very small glimpse into two characters. It basically followed kind of a second chance affair. I don't want to say affair. Basically followed a woman whose husband was a famous author and he recently passed away, and she ends up getting in touch with one of his publishers and their romance that follows. But like I said, it was only a 4-part, very short audiobook novella, so I gave it 3 stars. It was still Kennedy Ryan. I still adored it, but it was not as well-rounded as her other books, so 3 stars is okay. The next book that I got to is Royal Holiday by Jasmine Guillory, and this is, again, kind of a novella. It's a lot shorter than her previous books. Jasmine Guillory wrote The Wedding Date, The Proposal, and The Wedding Party, which I haven't read, and I feel like I probably should have read that one because I think this is the spin-off of characters in that one. This was still fine though, like I still understood what was happening, but I feel like I probably would have gotten more had I read that one first. This is interesting though, because this is obviously like a royal holiday romance, like hello, it's called Royal Holiday. So this is following, I think, one of our characters that we meet in one of the previous books, and she takes her mom with her to England for a work assignment, and it follows her mom's romance, which was something that was very exciting to actually see. Like, you never really see spin-offs of our characters' parents' romances. So we follow Vivian, who is the mother of a previous character from a book, and she ends up falling for one of the royal ambassadors on this trip that she ends up taking. And it's just a very short, cute story, and it's very much set in a royalty setting around the holiday times. And that's it. Like, if you're just looking for some good holiday royal fluff, this is definitely it. It's a very quick read. I gave it 3 stars. It was nothing amazing, but it was actually a pretty unique reading experience because we very rarely read modern contemporary romance that is following someone who is not in like their 20s or 30s. Like, she's in her 50s. So it was kind of nice to see. So I liked this, but it was nothing amazing. So I gave it 3 stars. Okay, the next book I read was also a novella. I read a lot of novellas this month. That is Kingdom of Needle and Bone by Mira Grant. Mira Grant wrote Into the Drowning Deep, which you guys know is one of my favorite books of all time. This was a novella that released last year that I managed to get my hands on a copy, like a hard copy, which is super rare to find. This was interesting, and I feel like this book, I'm curious to see how well this book would have been received if it was released as like a big full-length novel, because this takes on the vaccine debate that is currently happening and puts it into like a horror story setting. But again, it's very, very short. This book is like 100 pages long. So whether you were pro-vaccine or anti-vaccine, this book basically kind of ended the debate between that, because basically a virus gets released into this world that completely negates vaccines. And it follows a doctor who is basically trying to save humankind because we have reached a point where there are just waves of viruses that are just taking out more and more of the population. And it follows her and her solution for what's happening. But like I said, it's super short. It's like 100 pages long. So I think this would have been really great in a full-length novel where we really got to explore all of the characters, because there's still a couple plot twists that happen in this that were like jaw-dropping to me in such a short amount of time, which is saying something. But I would have liked to see this be a full-length novel. So I gave it 3 stars. It was still great. It was still a Mira Grant book, so it was very like science-based horror, which is what she excels at, but just a very little tiny snippet of it. So those are my thoughts on that one. Okay, the next book that I got to is The 10,000 Doors of January by Alex E. Harrow. This is a book that everybody and their mom was reading this year, and I really just wanted to read it this year because I feel like it's not going to be relevant beyond this year. Is that harsh? I feel like it's a harsh thing to say, but I feel like it's true. It's one of those books that was all the craze during like BEA and BookCon and whatnot. So I read this, and After reading this, I looked at a lot of reviews, and I am falling in the same category as a majority of people's reviews of this book. It's hard to rate because the writing in this is stunning. Like, the writing is so beautiful in this, and it's a very, like, dreamlike type of writing, but it's historical fiction mixed with portal fantasy. So it's covering a lot of things that I generally don't touch, and I thoroughly enjoyed myself reading this book because of the writing alone, so that's saying something. That's my pro for this book. The writing was beautiful. Like, I wanted to, like, highlight so many passages. There were just so many sentences where I'm just like, oh, she put those words together beautifully. But that's kind of where my praise is gonna stop for this book. I really, really liked the concept, the writing. I feel like the story just got boring, though. Like, I was on board, and I was meeting all the people and learning all of the things, but by the end, I was ready for it to be over. Like, I think it was paced really, really slowly and weirdly, because there were certain jumps in time that, like, all of a sudden the pacing got really fast, and then it would slow back down again. So I think the pacing was a little weird and slow and dragging at certain points. So I think that's kind of where my main issues lie with it, is that it was just kind of very slow moving. Which is okay for really beautifully written stories. I feel like that's generally two things that go hand in hand, like beautiful writing, slow pacing, so you can appreciate the beautiful writing. But ultimately, looking back at this, I feel like very little happened in this story. Like, for the huge world that we were introduced to and the whole setup that we had slowly given to us, not much happened in the world. Like, yes, there was a whole plot and there was a linear timeline that we followed, but it was just kind of not exciting. Ugh. So I gave this 3 stars. Okay, the next book is finishing out Friday-Thon. This one I at least put up in the 3-star section, pretty far up in it as well. And I feel yucky saying this because this ended up being my favorite book that we read in Friday-Thon, which is saying something because this book is very awful. Not in the terms of, like, the writing or how it's told or anything like that, but this is true crime, and this is based on, like, a very real-life, modern serial killer that existed not that long ago, like, in the 2000s. So it makes me feel uncomfortable saying that I liked this book, but the writing was great. Like, how it was told was really thought-provoking and very fast-paced and kept you at your edge of your seat. But it was just so uncomfortable and awkward because the majority of this book, the serial killer has already been caught, and it's him sitting in his interrogations and just confessing to everything, but it's in such a way that it just makes you, like, hate him so much more just because he's nonchalant about everything that he says. He's basically bargaining with them to get the death penalty because he doesn't, like, want to live with himself anymore, and he's basically feeding them things that he did and where the bodies are and all of these things in order to get stuff from them, like literally just to get, like, cigarettes or, like, a drink or something. He'll be like, I'll tell you where this body is if you give me another cigarette. Like, it's uncomfortable and it's real, which is why I'm, like, weird about this whole situation, because it's written really well. Like, you were flipping pages left and right because you wanted to know what was happening, and it just made you feel crazy uncomfortable because all of this shit went down. But I don't know. I gave it 3 stars because, again, it was well written and it told the story really well, but it made me very icky feeling. The end. Alrighty, the next book I want to talk about is another novella. Surprise. But I finally managed to listen to Rolling in the Deep by Mira Grant. This is the prequel novella to Into the Drowning Deep, which I mentioned earlier, same author as Kingdom of Needle and Bone. Shauna Maguire, by the way. It's her horror pen name. So I finally got to this. I've been wanting to read it since I read Into the Drowning Deep, and the audiobook was randomly like an Audible deal of the day thing for like $1, so I downloaded it. And it was so great. This is the first 4-star book, by the way, that I'm getting to in this wrap-up, and it's just as great as I remember Into the Drowning Deep being, but just in a very condensed way. Like, it was a very short. It was like 3 hours to listen to, so I'm assuming it would probably only be like maybe 100 to 150 pages long in physical form. And it was just kind of a really good setup, but backwards, because I'm pretty sure Rolling in the Deep came out after Into the Drowning Deep because it was a prequel. So it kind of gave you a lot of the answers that you were looking for from the previous book. So that's all I gotta say. I don't want to spoil Into the Drowning Deep for you guys by talking about this one. It was basically a really good companion novel to that book, so I gave that one 4 stars. The next book I want to talk about is The Arrangement by Robin Harding. I know a lot of people have been reading this recently because it just released and it was kind of like a big talked about book. And I really enjoyed it. I know this is a very polarizing book. A lot of people either strongly disliked it or they really liked it. Like, it was just all over the place with ratings. Okay, this was a story basically about a girl who ends up getting a sugar daddy and some shit goes down that she ends up getting involved in that she did not sign up for, obviously. What I really liked about this was the discussion that it introduced into the story, because we were reading from both her perspective and her sugar daddy's perspective. So we're in both of their heads, so we can see how things are justified from both sides of the story, which was interesting. I really liked that she did that for the book. And it also opened up the conversation about sex workers and the reputation that being a sugar baby could have in society if people found out about it. And that was also an added element of tension to the story because she was trying to keep this hidden from everybody in her life, that she was doing this. And then it takes a turn when some murdering happens, basically. I'm not going to spoil the book or anything. And she gets thrown into this whole situation that she was already nervous about being a part of, and then it gets like real messed up from there. So I really liked the conversations that it opened up about sex workers and how it opened up about just kind of like sexism and feminism in general when it comes to the sexual culture that we live in. So that was a really cool part of the book that I really liked. And I also really like seeing both perspectives, both like her and the sugar daddy's perspective, because you start to see inside of their heads. And his perspective was, in my mind, kind of reminiscent of the book You, where like, you know that he's doing something wrong. Like, you understand that everything he's doing is bad, but you're in his head and you can see him justifying things and you can see him start to care for her and have feelings for people. I don't want to say you start to sympathize with him, but you start to kind of like understand it a little bit more. And it was just, I think it was really well written. Is it like the most amazing thing I've ever read? No, but it was actually really fun while I was reading it. So I gave it 4 stars. The next book that I read was The Right Swipe by Alicia Ray, I think. And this was a somewhat recent release of like an adult contemporary romance that is the first book in a series, I believe, that basically follows a woman who created an app that is essentially Tinder, like in a fictional world. And it is her relationship with a guy that she hooked up with in the past who ghosted her, and she completely wrote off and was super offended about the whole situation. They end up getting thrown back together, and it is their story. So I gave this 4 stars. The romance itself, I didn't think was that great. The characters were okay. What I really liked about this book was all of the conversations that it opened up. There were a lot of things discussed in this book. Like, it discussed all of the issues dealing with concussions in the NFL. That's something that, like, you don't really see discussed in books, let alone contemporary romance books. It also discussed, like, women in the workplace and women being in high points of power in the workforce. So just touched on personality points that were never fully addressed about our protagonist, who I believe is somewhat on the autism spectrum, but it was never like fully announced. She just has a lot of things that were mentioned repeatedly in the story that leads you to assume that she might have some sort of social issue, whether she is autistic or not, or whether she just has a social disorder or not. We just get to see a little bit of a glimpse into that, which was really nice to see. Also, in a woman of power in the work world, seeing that also as a part of her was interesting. It also dealt with sexual harassment issues that you can deal in your career path, and it just touched on a lot of important society issues, which were really interesting to see explored in what I thought was going to be a really fluffy romance. So all of those things made me give it a 4 star. I don't think it was the best romance that I've ever read. Like, I don't think either of the characters were particularly amazing, but all of the things that they dealt with individually were amazing. So I gave it 4 stars. I really liked it. I will definitely be continuing on with the series at this point, because I'm sold on the author, if nothing else, and I'm curious to see what other things that she introduces into her stories. Okay, this next book is taking a turn, guys, and you're probably gonna question some of my morals in life. But I read nonfiction periodically, and the stuff that I'm interested in is not the norm. I'll be the first person to admit that. So, I read a book called Stiff by Mary Roach. It's The Curious Life of Human Cadavers. This is literally a nonfiction book about dead people. And It's a very widely received book. Like, this book has thousands of ratings. It's a bestseller. Like, it's a big title, and I was just curious about it. So it's basically about a woman's fascination with what happens to dead bodies, what happens when we die, what happens to your physical body. And she explores all avenues of what it means to be an organ donor, how cadavers are used in the scientific field, whether they are used for like crash test subjects or whether they're used for practice for surgeons, or any sort of donating to science or donating to people who need your organs. It was fascinating. I know it's not going to be everybody's cup of tea. I will be the first person to admit that, but it was fascinating. And I am just a morbidly curious person about scientific things. And for some reason, anything revolving around death is very taboo in our society. And it was just it lifted up the curtain to like what's behind the stuff that people are scared to talk about. And it was just, if nothing else, it kind of gave you some comfort about what happens to your body when you die. As in, like, you just kind of learn things instead of it just being this, like, mysterious, scary thing that we don't talk about. It was eye-opening. I really liked it. I gave it 4 stars. I'm gonna read her other books now because she has some nonfiction books about some weird topics. Moving back to the card. The next book I want to talk about was a huge surprise for me. This is Anna Dressed in Blood by Kendare Blake. This was October's book club pick for my book club, which is always linked down in my description if you guys want to read along with me. This is the book that we read in October, and I was so pleasantly surprised by this book. It was so dang good, especially because this was published in 2011. This is an old YA title. I tend to go into backlist titles knowing that things are still going to be very tropey, that haven't been overdone at this point. This was so good. This was like Buffy meets Supernatural. It was just, I loved all of the characters, all of the kids acted their age, the parents were included, and it was just, I loved it. This book follows a kid who is essentially like a ghostbuster. Like, he travels all over with his mom, like his mom is fully aware of his powers, and he basically goes to areas that are renowned for being haunted with a very like specific ghost or creature or spirit or whatever, and he goes and he takes them out for the good of humanity. So it basically follows him when he moves to this town to take out Anna, a girl who is dressed in blood. It's a whole story, and his relationship with her and with all of the new people in this town, and it was just so fun. Like, I just thoroughly enjoyed myself the entire time I was reading it, and I'm so excited to pick up the sequel, because it's only a duology. But like, if this is where Kendare Blake started, no wonder she's a very beloved author at this point, because this was so great. For being such an older title, it's so good. These next 3 books that I'm gonna get to all go together, but it's my 4 into 5-star section, and that is the last 3 books of the Collector series by Dot Hutchinson. The first book in the series is called The Butterfly Garden. I've been talking about it a lot on my channel. I get very nervous talking about these books on my channel because they are so triggering, they are so disturbing, but a lot of you guys are also starting to pick it up and you're loving it as well. So just know, I've said it in every video, look at the content warnings for this series because there are many. They are intense and they are to be taken very seriously. Like, there is so many triggering things in all of these books. So book 2 is The Roses of May. This basically follows the same group of investigators that we get introduced to in book 1, but following a serial killer. Who basically has been killing girls and leaving flowers on them. That's where the title comes from. And I really enjoyed this one. I gave this one 4 stars. I really like this one because it really starts to show us all of the characters that were in the investigator crew that we really follow through the rest of the books. But this one is probably the tamest one out of the 4 books in this series. It still is super disturbing, still follows a serial killer who still does really messed up stuff, and it still is very triggering for a lot of people, but this one is probably the tamest and the closest to what a lot of people consider normal thrillers. So I gave this one 4 stars. Book 3 is my favorite one, and this one is probably up there with book 1 with being the most triggering. This is called The Summer Children. This one deals heavily with sexual abuse of children and everything that can go along with that, and it's super disturbing, and you see a lot of stuff firsthand. Like, it's extremely graphic. So again, take these with all of the content warnings before you dive into this, but this is probably my favorite book in the series because it's so impactful. And at this point, we know the crew of investigators really well, and we know how things are affecting them. So this one, it's heavy, but I gave this one 5 stars. So this is like my 5-star section. I still have The fourth book to talk about, this one I gave 4 stars. It was still really, really good. And this one tied up some loose ends that we had left through the rest of the series. So I believe this is the last book in the series, but I gave this one 4 stars, gave this one 5 stars. That's the order that I'm going in. And that leads me up to a reread, which was a 5-star book and still one of my favorite books of all time. The Simple Wild by K.A. Tucker. This was the romance book that we started doing for my book club. A lot of people said they were romance readers and they wanted to read a romance book with me, so I said, hey, let's start with one that I know is going to be very well loved. And sure enough, it was. Everybody loved this book. I loved this book. This was a reread. I read this last year. It was my favorite romance of 2018. It's just as good. And I was nervous going in as a reread because, like, I had high expectations and I remember loving it, and I'm always nervous to go back to a book and see if it still holds up to that. It 100% does. I still bawled my eyes out, I still got way too emotionally invested in these characters, and I still swooned real hard over Jonah. So if you guys have not read this, read it. It's easily K.A. Tucker's best work, and she is going back and revisiting this world. There is a sequel coming out to this in March, which I cannot wait for. But this basically is all of the tropes that I love. We are taking a somewhat spoiled city girl, and we are transplanting her to Alaska. And that is way out of a city girl's element, as in, like, she is in, like, the Alaskan bush. Like, she is working with the bush pilots. And it's basically her kind of reconnecting with her long-lost father and really getting to know the people in this town and learning that, like, a small town environment is just a very comforting and well-accepting place. And it was just so great. I just love this book so much. If you haven't read it, definitely pick it up. It's one of my favorite books of all time. 5 stars. That is completing my October wrap-up. This is gonna be the longest video ever to edit. But those are all of the 18 books that I read in October. It was mediocre. I mean, it got good. It got good. I had some good books at the end there, but it was not the best reading month for me. So I'm looking forward to November and picking some good titles out for myself. That's gonna be it for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I'll see you guys in my next one.